My name is Eva Benton, and that morning I arrived at the office early, as I always did. The 13th floor of the Crawford and Bell building, where the prestigious consulting firm Nolan and Pierce resided, always smelled of burnt coffee and a faint, cloying perfume that clung to the air like a bad memory. My mind was still foggy from a dreamless, restless sleep, but even my worst nightmares felt gentler than the reality I was about to walk into. At 11:30 a.m., I stepped into the main conference room, the polished glass table gleaming under the recessed ceiling lights, making the executives seated around it look like contestants in a high-stakes game show. I was clutching a lunch tray I had meticulously assembled for the data development team: 3 kale salads with dressing on the side, 2 turkey sandwiches on whole wheat, and a non-fat latte with 1 pump of sugar-free vanilla. An order I knew matched the precise preferences of my older sister, Madison. She was the executive director of innovation here, the board's golden child, and the same person who had once looked me dead in the eye at a family dinner and said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, "Nice job running deliveries, sis." I weaved between the tailored suits and silk blouses, my movements careful and practiced, trying not to spill a single drop. I placed the latte on the table in front of Madison just as she was passionately laying out her strategy for the next fiscal quarter. She didn't look up. She didn't thank me. No one in that room even acknowledged my presence. Not a nod, not a glance. I was just Eva, the quiet, familiar shadow who made things run smoothly in the background. And then it happened. As I turned to leave, my task completed, Madison abruptly stood up, the latte in her hand. She glided over to me with the theatrical grace of a performer on a Broadway stage. "Eva," she said, her voice so sugary it could rot teeth, "remember what I told you last time about non-fat lattes? They have to be extra hot." I didn't have time to respond before the scalding coffee hit my left thigh. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated act of humiliation. I froze, a gasp caught in my throat. A searing, white-hot pain shot from my thigh down to my knee. My slacks were soaked through, the heat pressing against my skin like a hot iron. Madison gasped theatrically, a hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Eva. I am so sorry. That was a complete accident. I hope you're okay." Then she added, with a lilting, cruel sweetness, "But hey, you're used to cleaning up messes, right?" A ripple of laughter, sharp and clean as a razor's edge, went through the room. Some people covered their mouths, their eyes crinkling in amusement. Others turned away, suddenly fascinated by their notes. But no one said a word in my defense. No one offered me a napkin. No one asked if I was hurt. They looked at me as if I were a piece of live, interactive entertainment, a brief, amusing interlude in their very important day. I stood there, my hand gripping the edge of the glass table to steady myself, my jaw clenched so hard it ached. I didn't cry. I didn't run away. I simply turned and looked Madison straight in the eyes. She met my gaze and raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her lips curling into a smug, triumphant smile. She had won. Again. And then, the heavy glass doors of the conference room flew open. No one saw it coming. No one was prepared for the man who walked in. Dorian, my husband, stepped into the room, wearing a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the air out of the space. He didn't need to speak. With a single, sweeping glance, all the laughter died. He walked to the center of the room, placed his leather briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive thud, and slowly scanned every face, his gaze as cold and sharp as ice. He paused on Madison for exactly 3 seconds. "I just reviewed the surveillance footage from the hallway camera," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge that could cut steel. "Everyone in this room who failed to intervene during that act of workplace harassment, consider this your final day as an employee of Nolan and Pierce." A collective, silent gasp. No one could breathe. I had never seen a room full of powerful people go pale so quickly. A man in the corner swallowed so loudly it echoed in the stunned silence. "As of this morning," Dorian continued, his eyes still locked on Madison, "my firm, Dorson Capital, has acquired a controlling interest in this company. HR will be sending out the official termination notices within the hour. And if anyone wishes to file a complaint, I will make myself available for a court hearing." No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. Dorian then turned to me. He didn't touch me, Didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. I walked out of that conference room, my clothes still damp, the faint scent of coffee and burnt sugar rising from my ruined slacks. The sting on my thigh was nothing compared to the sting of their silent complicity. I didn't look back. Dorian's words were the punctuation mark on a chapter of my life I had just closed. But this public act was only the final scene. The play had been running for 3 years, and for 3 years, this company, led by my sister, had pretended I didn't exist. I joined Nolan and Pierce right after earning my MBA from NYU. I didn't use my family connections, and I certainly didn't lean on Dorian, even though by then he was already a formidable, if quiet, force in the investment world. I wanted to prove myself on my own merit, not as someone's wife, and certainly not as Madison's little sister. And I did. In my first year, I proposed and developed a predictive model for consumer behavior based on seasonal and sociological trends. It was complex, groundbreaking work. At first, no one paid attention. Then, the finance department noticed that my model had directly contributed to an 8% boost in second quarter revenue. I thought, finally, I would be recognized. Then, one Monday morning, I walked past the executive boardroom and saw Madison's presentation on the main screen. Her name was at the bottom right corner. The model, from its elegant structure to its core algorithm, was mine. Every line of code bore my signature markers. But I stayed silent. It's fine, I told myself. As long as the company grows. A month later, Madison was featured in the internal company newsletter as the creative mind behind the Q2 growth strategy. There was no mention of me. I received a brief, dismissive email from HR. Thank you for your technical support. Support. The next time I developed a new system, this one for analyzing search trends using heat map data, Madison invited me to co-develop the project. Then she gently suggested I stay in the background during the presentation for a more polished and executive-facing delivery. That's when I began to understand. I was allowed to be brilliant, as long as I was brilliant in the dark. The rest of the company, taking their cues from her, quickly learned to follow suit. I once saw a misforwarded internal email from the head of marketing, Alex Grant, joking, Eva should just run the company cafeteria. At least she'd be seen there. An intern I had spent 3 months mentoring once sent a Slack message, clearly meant for someone else. I still can't figure out what Eva actually does here. The truth was, they knew. They just found it more convenient to pretend they didn't. One afternoon in March, I stepped into an elevator just as Madison and a few senior managers were exiting a meeting. They were laughing and chatting about an upcoming investor visit. As the doors began to close, Madison caught my eye and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, Eva, don't forget to refill the coffee in the break room. You missed the sugar last time." The elevator erupted in polite, knowing laughter. I stared at the floor indicator, my face a blank mask, and didn't blink. I had learned to be so quiet that they mistook my silence for surrender. But what they didn't know was that I was saving everything. Every original draft with its metadata and timestamps. Every email chain. Every slide deck that had my name on it before it was quietly replaced with hers. I stored it all on a personal, encrypted drive I had named Arya, a small, secret act of defiance. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. I used to stay silent out of a deep-seated fear of being labeled. In the corporate world, if a woman stands her ground, she's aggressive. If she's too soft, she's a liability. I was trapped between those two impossible extremes. And Madison, my sister, the one who had once read my 10th grade diary aloud to her friends for a laugh, had evolved. She was more strategic now, more polished in her cruelty, and she had an entire corporation to amplify her narrative. She didn't need to shout to erase me. All she had to do was smile for the camera. But I had changed too. I was no longer the quiet girl in the blue cardigan, hiding behind a presentation board, hoping someone would notice my work. I was just waiting for the right moment to turn on the lights. That morning, the air in the first-floor lobby of the Nolan and Pierce headquarters was so still and tense it felt like you could choke on it. The reception staff wore new, crisply ironed uniforms. The digital board by the entrance scrolled a silent, elegant welcome. Nolan and Pierce welcomes Mrs. Valerie Benton and the investors from Sterling Equity. Valerie Benton. My mother. A founding shareholder of the firm, and, At 67, a woman who still moved every piece on the corporate chessboard with the dispassionate precision of a grandmaster. From charity galas to ruthless restructuring strategies, she always knew exactly where she stood and who she needed to push aside to stay there. I stood 3 steps away from the reception desk, holding a leather-bound folio of documents I had prepared for the meeting. Madison was already comfortably ensconced in the VIP lounge, her hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a navy silk dress and pearl-colored heels, a combination I knew for a fact my mother had chosen for her on a trip to Paris. When Valerie swept in, her presence commanding the attention of the entire lobby, she didn't scan the room for me. She strode forward, confident and brisk, and the junior staff members nearly leaped out of their chairs to greet her. I took a small step forward and said, my voice quiet but clear, "Hi, Mom." She gave me a quick, dismissive side glance. No nod, no reply. Her look was like a fluorescent light, bright, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. When the investors from Sterling Equity arrived, a phalanx of men in dark suits, she led them into the main hall. Each person was handed a glossy company profile, a document I had spent a week editing, rewriting, and polishing, line by painstaking line. At the bottom, under Strategic Vision, was a single name, Madison Benton, Chief Innovation Officer. I walked behind the group, an unnamed, unacknowledged assistant. Ladies and gentlemen, my mother began, her voice imbued with a poised and practiced authority. Let me introduce the visionary who has guided Nolan and Pierce through the post-pandemic recovery, the mind behind all of our recent technological transitions, my daughter, Madison Benton. Madison smiled, stepped forward, and shook hands with each investor. Polite applause followed. I stood near the presentation screen, the remote for the slideshow still in my hand. No one looked at me. No one asked, "And who is this?" Valerie's gaze swept past me as if I were a piece of furniture, a side table holding a vase of flowers. Then she turned back to her audience, her voice dropping with deliberate weight. This company is a family. And in this family, we believe in those who create vision. The emphasis on the word create was unmistakable. It was a public and deliberate erasure. I took a half step back, melting into the shadows at the edge of the large LED screen as Madison began her speech. I recognized the words immediately. It was the exact draft I had written 2 days prior, with only 3 minor sections altered. The rest, word for word, was mine. During the Q&A session, an older investor with shrewd, intelligent eyes, a Mr. Harold Stanton, turned toward me, a puzzled expression on his face. "And you are? Forgive me, I don't see your name on the coordination list." Before I could answer, my mother cut in, her voice clipped and efficient. "That's Eva. She provides behind-the-scenes support. She's excellent with systems operations. Madison handles the strategic direction." Support. That word again. The same word from the HR email. It was the official company line for my existence. I managed a calm smile and nodded, saying nothing more. To speak up now would have been seen as disruptive, emotional. At the end of the session, while the investors were being led on a tour of the offices, I slipped away from the group. I needed a moment to breathe, to quell the tight, cramping knot in my stomach. I ducked into the empty data tech room, the coldest room on the floor, and leaned against a server rack, the cool metal a welcome shock against my back. On a nearby desk lay a copy of the research funding contract with MIT, a partnership I had spent nearly 4 months negotiating. I opened it. The signature lines were filled, Madison Benton, and the Chief Financial Officer. My name, the one that had been on every draft and every email, was gone. I pulled out my phone, opened the encrypted ARIA folder, and snapped a picture of the document. Not as a threat, but as a reminder to myself that I wasn't imagining it. That this was real. When I returned to the main hall, Madison was laughing with Harold Stanton, a glass of white wine in her hand. My mother stood beside her, beaming with proprietary pride. I stood in the doorway, looking at the 3 of them, and a single, stark thought crystallized in my mind. If this is family, why do I feel like an intruder? And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't wait for someone else to rescue me. I was going to have to rewrite my own story, line by quiet line, using the very silence they had mistaken for weakness. My rebellion began not with a shout, but with a black USB stick, no bigger than my thumb. It was encrypted, and it never once connected to an internal company network. In my small, overlooked office, tucked between two rows of dusty filing cabinets, I began to build my arsenal. Every evening, after the office had emptied out, I would methodically copy the original files of every project I had ever worked on, the proprietary slide decks, the experimental predictive models, the signed comparison charts with their original timestamps. I placed everything into a folder labeled 13A, an internal code that corresponded to the very first project Madison had stolen from me. Each piece of evidence was a small, silent battery. Together, they held enough power to light up a city. I also installed a sophisticated screen recording software on my office computer, configured to automatically log and record any instance where a file bearing my digital signature was modified by another IP address within the company. In my email, I created a private, automated rule that forwarded every internal message related to my projects to a separate, secure address under the pseudonym Eros. Only Dorian and I knew of its existence. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and defensive. This wasn't about retaliation, it was about self-preservation. I started recording key meetings, especially those where Madison presented strategies based on the models I had developed. During one virtual seminar with our partners in South Korea, I captured the moment Madison, when asked about the underlying data structure of a model, fumbled for an answer. "We built this entire framework from scratch," she'd said, with a confident smile. The concept was mine. She couldn't even pronounce the name of the core algorithm correctly. I didn't react. I simply saved the recording, clipped the relevant section, and labeled it Stripped Credit Q4. About 3 weeks later, I received a message on LinkedIn. It was from a woman named Megan Riley, the director of strategy at Whitestone Group, a respected tech firm specializing in healthcare data. "Eva," the message read, "I came across a mention of the seasonal location model you developed in an academic journal. The potential applications are tremendous. Would you be open to a conversation? We're looking for someone to lead our new regional market integration team." I read the message 3 times. Not because I was surprised by the offer, but because her words, "the model you developed," felt like a quiet, validating hand on my shoulder, a touch I hadn't realized how desperately I craved. We met at a quiet cafe in Westwood. Megan had cropped silver hair, a warm, direct gaze, and a no-nonsense demeanor. "No pressure, Eva," she said. "We don't poach talent. We look for people who are solving problems in interesting ways." She showed me the job description. Director of Applied Analytics. Full authority to build a new team from the ground up. A starting budget of $1 million. And, most importantly, no family board of directors to answer to. I didn't give her an answer right away. I simply said, "Thank you for seeing me." That night, I went home and opened the large window in my living room that overlooked Century Bridge. The early June air was dry and cool. I held a cup of warm tea and opened my laptop. On one side of the screen was Megan's offer. On the other, the day's packet of backed-up evidence. The ARIA folder now contained over 120 meticulously organized files. I typed a single sentence into the body of an email draft, addressed to myself. The subject line was, "If I disappear tomorrow, what will remain?" And I knew the answer. The truth would remain. The second quarter strategy meeting was held in the main boardroom on the 22nd floor, a space reserved for senior executives and key stakeholders. I wasn't on the official invitation list, but I showed up anyway. I knew what was on the agenda. The opening slide of Madison's presentation glowed on the massive screen, Project Lumen, an exclusive terrain-based weather behavior analytics model from the Strategic Innovation Department. I almost laughed out loud. The Strategic Innovation Department was Madison. And Project Lumen was the exact model I had built from raw satellite data 4 months prior. She stood at the podium, poised and eloquent in a silver-gray suit, presenting a 6-month market research process and proprietary interpolation algorithms, language lifted directly from my original report. When she reached slide 9, a complex comparison of consumer behavior in Phoenix versus Milwaukee during extreme weather events, I raised my hand. Every head in the room turned toward me. Madison froze for a fraction of a second, then her professional smile clicked back into place. "Eva, do you have a question?" I stood up, my posture calm, my voice clear and even. Madison, would you mind sharing with the room the last time you were directly involved in the hands-on development of this model? A palpable silence descended on the room. Madison's smile faltered, the corner of her mouth twitching almost imperceptibly. Eva, I think there might be some confusion here. As I said, this was a team effort. I didn't back down. And who, specifically, was on that team? Because the three primary input data sets, the regional consumption flowchart, and the classification algorithm all originated from a system that I personally built and verified. Murmurs broke out around the table. Someone whispered, wasn't Lumen Eva's project? At the far end of the table, Matthew Reed, the chief technology officer, a man I respected, arched an eyebrow. Eva, he said slowly, do you have documentation to support your claim of intellectual ownership within our system? I nodded. Yes, I do. All of the original files, the complete edit logs, the relevant email chains, and the system logs were submitted to the legal department this morning. I've also sent a copy to an external IP attorney, formerly of the Whitestone Group. Madison visibly flinched. Under the table, I saw her hand clench around the presentation remote. Mr. Reed turned to Loretta Shaw, the head of the legal department, a formidable black woman in her 60s whose quiet voice could silence a room more effectively than a shout. Loretta, can you confirm receipt of this file? Loretta opened the folder in front of her and nodded. Confirmed. The file is complete. It includes all relevant metadata, timestamps, and internal video recordings. The sender was Eva Benton. Intellectual ownership is clearly established under the company's original creation clause. I didn't need to say another word. I sat down. The room was no longer whispering. People were talking openly. Jonah, a young data analyst I had mentored, raised his head. I can confirm Eva built the core of the model. She's the one who taught me how to normalize the input streams. Someone from the quality assurance team chimed in. We received all testing materials directly from Eva's account. We never worked with Madison during the testing phase. I didn't look at Madison. I didn't have to. I knew that her gaze was no longer a triumphant, piercing blade. It was the desperate, darting look of someone searching for an exit. The meeting was adjourned 13 minutes early. An internal investigation was announced to begin within 3 days by direct order of the CEO, who had been silently attending the meeting via Zoom from his office in London. As I closed my notebook and walked out of the room, Matthew Reed called my name. Eva. I turned. You'd better brace yourself, he said, his expression serious. These things are never simple. But this time, you've got the file. And you've got people. I nodded. I know. The next Monday morning, the atmosphere at Nolan and Pierce was electric with a nervous, unspoken anticipation. There were fresh flowers at the reception desk. The coffee machine in the break room had been polished until it gleamed. Mid-level executives walked the halls more quietly than usual, their eyes darting to their calendars, pretending not to notice the unscheduled 10 a.m. meeting that had appeared on the schedules of the entire executive board. I stepped into the central boardroom on the 18th floor. A small, silver USB stick was already plugged into the laptop connected to the main screen. I smoothed the cuff of my blouse and took a slow, deep breath. Madison walked in right behind me. She was wearing a crisp white suit, her smile gentle, but her eyes were like shards of ice. Eva, you really should have taken the day off, she said, her voice light and airy. Last week did more damage to your reputation than you think. I didn't reply. The door swung open again. 3 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits entered. The man in the lead was Dorian. Not the casual, supportive husband I knew, but the man people in the financial world whispered about but had rarely seen in person. The CEO of Aldane Capital, the silent, strategic architect behind dozens of successful companies. The man the Wall Street Journal had once dubbed the quiet storm of the West Coast. Madison's face went white. Dorian, she managed, her voice a strained whisper. What are you doing here? He didn't answer her directly. He placed a thick leather-bound folder in front of Loretta Shaw, our head of legal, and another in front of Matthew Reed. I'm here as the new controlling stakeholder of Nolan and Pierce, he said, his voice calm and clear. Aldane Capital has finalized the acquisition of a 32% equity stake through a private trust vehicle. With that stake comes the right to restructure the executive board. The room was utterly silent. Madison opened her mouth to object, but Loretta spoke first, her voice firm. "We can confirm. The transaction is fully legal. Aldine Capital is now the primary voting authority." Dorian turned his attention to Madison. "For the past 6 months, your decisions have led to a series of serious internal grievances, documented violations of our intellectual property protocol, and a pattern of discriminatory behavior. I am not here to discuss this. I am here to act." He looked at me. I stood, walked to the front of the room, and clicked the remote. The first clip appeared on the screen, security camera footage from the previous week, showing Madison deliberately bumping into me with the hot latte. The angle was damning, leaving no room for interpretation. Next, a series of internal emails, including one from a senior manager, with Madison CC'd, referring to me as our diversity checkbox. Then, screenshots of my original presentation decks, with their metadata clearly visible, side by side with the versions that bore Madison's name. Finally, the audio clip of her on a call with our South Korean partners, fumbling to explain the very algorithm she claimed to have created. I turned off the screen. The silence in the room was a physical weight. Dorian nodded once. "By the authority granted to me under our new governance structure, I hereby suspend Madison Benton from all roles and responsibilities at Nolan and Pierce, effective immediately. Her case will be reviewed by an independent ethics board." "You can't do this." Madison finally snapped, her voice cracking. "This company was my mother's legacy. I built it." "You built it on what?" Dorian asked, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a cold contempt. "By erasing your sister? By stepping on the people who did the actual work and then covering it up with a rehearsed smile." No one defended her. Not a single voice rose in her favor. At that moment, the boardroom door opened, and my mother, Valerie, stood in the doorway. She didn't step inside. She just stood and watched, her face an unreadable mask. Madison turned to her, her voice desperate. "Mother." Valerie remained silent. She looked at me, a long, steady gaze, then turned and walked away, the door clicking shut behind her. In that moment, I knew I would never hear the words "well done" or "I'm proud of you" from the woman who gave me life. But I also knew, with a sudden, startling clarity, that I no longer needed to. I unplugged the USB stick and returned to my seat, my heart beating a calm, steady rhythm. Dorian gathered the folders and handed them to Loretta. "Begin a full review of all compromised intellectual property from the past 3 years," he said. "And issue a formal invitation for a joint venture with the Whitestone Group. Eva will lead the team." I looked at him. There was no need to say thank you. We had been through too much together to waste time on simple words. Outside, the office hummed along as it always did, but on the 18th floor, something irreversible had just happened. A fortress built on lies had crumbled, not with force, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of the truth. Madison left Nolan and Pierce on a rainy Friday afternoon. There was no farewell party, no company-wide email. She simply stepped into the elevator, her face a blank mask, dragging a small suitcase behind her. The silence that day wasn't tense. It was a quiet, collective exhalation of relief, as if the entire building had just shed a heavy, suffocating coat. 3 days later, her name was gone from the company directory, her office cleared out, her official portrait removed from the wall of executives. I sat in my new office, still on the 18th floor, but this time, the frosted glass of the door bore my name, Eva Benton, Director, Data and Analytics Ethics. I hadn't chosen the title. Dorian had offered me the position of Chief Innovation Officer, but I had declined. I didn't want to simply replace my sister. I wanted to rebuild. My first act was to institute a new, mandatory internal credit policy. Every project, every report, every single piece of work would now require a formal recognition form, clearly listing the creator, the collaborators, and the reviewers. The vague, corporate speak of joint effort and behind-the-scenes support was officially banned. Next, I launched an anonymous reporting system, a secure, encrypted platform where any employee could report ethical violations without fear of retaliation. The reports were reviewed not by HR, but by an independent 3-person panel composed of respected employees from different departments. Then I held a company-wide meeting. I stood in the main conference room, the same room where I had been humiliated just weeks before, and I faced 100 of my colleagues. I'm not here for revenge, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. I'm here to begin again. But we will not rebuild by burying what happened. We will acknowledge it, we will learn from it, and we will do better. There was no applause, but no one left. They listened, really listened, and at the end of the meeting, I found a small, folded note on my desk. There was no name on it. It just said, "Thank you for not yelling at us, even though you had every right to." Soon after, I finalized the partnership with the Whitestone Group. But it wasn't just a technical collaboration. Together, we established the Dataverse Scholarship, a program designed to support women of color pursuing advanced degrees in data science and information engineering. I reviewed the applications myself. I wasn't interested in transcripts or test scores. I asked for 3 things: a personal story, a description of how they hoped to change the tech industry, and a time they felt overlooked but couldn't speak up. One afternoon in early July, I returned to my office to find my mother standing outside the glass wall. She wasn't wearing one of her usual power suits. She was dressed in a simple knit coat, her face free of makeup, the silver strands at her temples clearly visible. I opened the door and invited her in. She stood by the window, looking out at the city, her back to me. She was silent for a long time before she spoke. "I read everything," she said, her voice soft. "The documents from the investigation. Not to argue, just to understand." I didn't reply. I just waited. She finally turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw not a judge, but a woman filled with a quiet, profound regret. I thought, "I believed you needed to be protected, to be corrected. But the truth is, I just didn't have the courage to accept that you didn't need anyone to draw your path for you." I poured her a cup of tea, no sugar, no milk. We didn't talk much more, but the space between us felt lighter than it had in my entire life. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "Don't ever let anyone rewrite your name again, Eva." I nodded. In August, Nolan and Pierce officially released its new internal ethics code. It was the first in the data analytics industry to include specific protections for intellectual contributions and for whistleblowers. An article in a leading tech journal called it a quiet revolution, led by a woman who never raised her voice. I declined all interview requests. I didn't attend the PR summits. I just worked. One evening, as I was staying late to review the scholarship applications, the janitor, a kind man named Luis who always worked on the 18th floor, poked his head into my office. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Ms. Benton? Things are different now. People aren't so scared anymore." I smiled. "Thank you for letting me know that, Luis." When I finally left the office around 10 p.m., a light rain was falling. I stood under the awning of the building, the cool, damp air a welcome relief. I remembered all the nights I had walked out of this building, my shoulders aching from the weight of my laptop and the heavier weight of being unseen. Tonight, my shoulders felt light. They used to call me a shadow. But I didn't need to scream to prove I was real. I just needed to hold on to the truth until the world was finally quiet enough to hear it. Eva's story is a powerful testament to the fact that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet, unwavering resolve that refuses to be broken. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, we can find inspiration in those who fight their battles not with shouting, but with the steadfast accumulation of truth. For anyone who has ever felt overlooked or has seen their name quietly erased from their own work, remember this: silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the patient, deliberate preparation for the moment when the truth can finally speak for itself, clearly and in a way that can never be denied. What do you think of Eva's journey? Was her quiet approach her greatest strength?